my neighbor's secret underground project. It's worse than a bunker. You ever get that gnawing feeling in your gut that something's just off? Like the universe is trying to tap you on the shoulder, whisper, hey, pay attention. That's been me for the last 2 months, and until today, I honestly thought I was just being paranoid. But now I'm sitting here, staring at a blinking cursor at 2:43 a.m. because I need to tell someone. Anyone, if this post gets deleted or my account goes dark, maybe at least one person out there will remember what I said. Let me rewind for a sec. I live in a small, quiet town in the Midwest. Real everybody knows everybody kind of place. Population's just under 8,000. We've got one high school, a dying strip mall, and a gas station that doubles as a diner on Sundays. It's the kind of place people either never leave or can't wait to. I'm 30, born and raised here, moved away for college, came back after my dad passed to help my mom settle into assisted living, ended up sticking around, got a remote IT job, decent enough income, and a house I inherited from my uncle. Not exactly exciting, but it's quiet, it's predictable. That is, until I started paying attention to my neighbor, Gary. Gary's maybe mid-50s, lived here longer than me, quiet guy, keeps to himself but not in a creepy way, at least not before. He'd wave when we passed each other, small talk about the weather, standard stuff, never had visitors, no pets, just him and that old two-story he kept in weirdly good shape. About 4 or 5 months ago, something changed. First it was subtle, less yard work, porch lights stayed off, garage door always shut, even during the day. At the time I chalked it up to winter blues or health stuff, didn't think too much about it. Then I noticed he stopped driving his car. I mean, like completely. It just sat there collecting dust and pollen. Still clean like he wiped it down, but never moved. That was weird. For a guy who used to run to the hardware store every other day, it was out of character. Then came the noises. This part's gonna sound nuts, but I swear on everything. I started hearing sounds at night coming from his house. Not loud, but noticeable if you're up late like I usually am. Rhythmic clangs like hammering or drilling. At first I thought he was doing late night renovations, but it kept going. Every night, around the same time, midnight to 3 a.m. And then came the dirt. A couple weeks later, I spotted fresh mounds of soil by the side of his garage, like he was digging something and trying to spread the excess dirt in random spots across his backyard. I didn't see any machinery or rented dumpsters, just dirt, and these weird metal pipes sticking out of the ground, short ones, maybe 6 inches tall, spaced perfectly apart, vents. That's when my gut started whispering, this isn't normal. Still, I brushed it off, told myself maybe he's installing a storm shelter or something. We're in tornado country, plenty of people build bunkers. But something about the way he moved, the way he avoided eye contact, like he knew I was noticing, it stuck with me. Then he disappeared. One morning I walked out to get my mail and realized I hadn't seen Gary in over a week. His car hadn't moved, no lights, no sounds, nothing, just that same stillness like the house was asleep. Until that night. At exactly 12:07 a.m. I heard the sounds again. But this time they weren't inside the house. They were beneath it. I killed the lights in my living room and stood by the window, heart thumping in my throat. Gary's house was completely dark, no porch light, no glow from inside, but the sound was still going. I cracked the window slightly, careful not to make noise. The cool night air brought the noise in clearer. It was rhythmic, purposeful, not like someone messing around, like someone building. I barely slept that night, my brain just wouldn't shut off. The next morning I made myself a strong cup of coffee and sat on my porch like I sometimes do when I need to think. I figured if Gary was still home, maybe I'd catch a glimpse. Nothing. His trash bins hadn't moved in over a week. Mail was still piling up in his box. I even walked over and took a peek. Nothing but junk mail and a flyer from the local church about canned food donations. I started to wonder, if he was still in there, why was he picking it up? I did something I probably shouldn't have. I knocked. No answer, not even movement inside. I listened. Not a creak, not a shuffle, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. That afternoon, I called the non-emergency line for the county sheriff's office. I didn't want to sound dramatic, so I framed it like a wellness check. Hi, yeah, I'm just a little concerned about my neighbor, I said. Haven't seen him in a while and there's been some weird stuff going on. They said they'd send someone to take a look. 2 days passed, no visit, or if someone did come by, I never saw them. By the weekend, I was checking out Gary's house obsessively. I'd take casual walks around the block, slow down near his place, try to catch anything out of the ordinary. That's when I noticed something else. There was a new structure on the side of his house. Not a full addition, more like a small metal door built flush into the earth near his foundation. It hadn't been there before. It was painted the same color as his siding, almost like he wanted it to blend in, but I could see the fresh cement lines. This thing was recent. I got closer, it didn't have a handle, just a sealed edge and what looked like a keypad on the side. The dude built a secure hatch into the ground. That was the moment I stopped pretending this was normal. I started keeping notes, dates, times, sounds. I made a spreadsheet like some true crime podcast nerd. I even wrote down the exact moment the digging noises started and ended every night, always around 12:05 a.m., always ending just after 3. And then I noticed a pattern. Every Friday at exactly 2:30 a.m., the noise would stop for precisely 7 minutes, then resume. I had no clue, maybe a break, maybe something was being lowered, maybe something or someone was leaving. I started dreaming about it, literally. I had a dream where I walked into Gary's basement and there was a massive elevator that went down. No walls, just a platform suspended by cables. In the dream, I pushed the button and it started descending so fast I couldn't breathe. I woke up in a cold sweat, heart racing like I'd just run a mile. That morning, I decided I needed answers. Not the kind you find online, not the kind you wait around hopping to get. I was gonna find out what was happening over there, even if it meant going full conspiracy mode. The next day I drove 2 towns over and picked up a cheap trail cam, the kind hunters use, motion-activated, night vision, real subtle. I figured I'd mount it across the street, angled toward the side of Gary's house, maybe catch some movement, something, anything. I also bought one of those handheld vibration sensors off Amazon, the kind that detects tremors or movement through solid material. It's meant for detecting pipe leaks or, apparently, digging. That night I sat in the dark, holding that thing against my living room floor, watching the little green LED flicker every time I felt the distant thud from next door. This wasn't just a guy building a storm shelter anymore. He was building something bigger. And I was starting to think, maybe it wasn't meant to keep things out. Maybe it was meant to keep something in. By Monday, the trail cam caught something. Not much, just a brief flicker, a figure hunched over, dragging what looked like a long, wrapped object toward the side hatch. Timestamp 2:33 a.m., just like the gap I'd been tracking, just like the pattern. The quality was grainy, but I could make out a few details: dark clothes, something on the head that looked like a hood or helmet. Whatever they were dragging, it was heavy, took effort, like dead weight. I stared at that footage for hours, rewatched it like it was the Zapruder film. Every frame felt like a punch in the gut. I wasn't just being paranoid. I didn't tell anyone. I thought about it briefly. Maybe if I sent it to the cops, they'd take it seriously, but I knew how that'd go. They'd call it blurry, inconclusive, and not probable cause. So instead, I called my brother, Eli. Eli's the kind of guy who's always 2 steps from going off-grid. He once spent 6 months living in a converted van, swearing off modern society, and eating nothing but beans and rice. I figured if anyone would entertain this, it was him. "You think your neighbor's building a bunker?" he asked, not even trying to sound surprised. "Honestly, can't blame the guy. You've seen the news lately." "No man," I said, "not just a bunker. He's building something else, something weird." I told him about the camera footage, the digging noises, the keypad door in the ground. I left out the part where I hadn't actually seen Gary in almost 2 months. Eli was quiet for a bit, then he said, "You know what this sounds like, right?" "What?" "Either he's hiding from something, or he's preparing for something he knows is coming." That line stuck with me for days. The word preparing kept echoing in my head like an alarm bell. Because the truth is, Gary wasn't always like this. He used to be normal. I mean, as normal as a retired defense contractor with no family and a bunch of conspiracy bumper stickers can be. But still, he'd wave when you drove by, mow his lawn every Saturday, show up to the neighborhood barbecues with 6-packs of warm beer. I remember one afternoon, years back, we were both out back fixing fences, and he just randomly said, "You ever think about how fast society would collapse if the grid went down?" I laughed, thought it was a joke. He didn't. "I'm serious," he said. 3 days, tops. After that, it's Mad Max." I told him he watched too many movies. He just nodded and said, "I've seen what people are capable of." Didn't say where, didn't say when, but that was the only time I ever saw him look haunted. Anyway, back to now. I started seeing packages on his porch again, but not the normal kind. These were crates, wooden ones, with markings I didn't recognize, some kind of alphanumeric code spray painted on the sides, always delivered at night, always gone by morning. I was losing it, man. I felt like I was in one of those slow burn thrillers, where the main character spirals deeper and deeper until he doesn't know what's real anymore. I stopped sleeping, I drank too much coffee. I kept the cam running 24/7, rotated batteries religiously, catalogued every movement. And then came the smell. Not strong, not constant, but metallic, earthy, like ozone and soil mixed with something faintly chemical. It drifted over one night like fog, hung in the air for an hour, then vanished. I stood in my yard, sniffing like a bloodhound, and realized it was coming from Gary's vent. He had installed one of those big metal ventilation tubes on the side of the house, running straight up from the ground. I'd seen it before but figured it was for heating or something, but now it was humming, low and constant. That meant there was active airflow down there. Which meant he was still inside. I had a choice to make. I could keep watching from a distance, keep pretending I was just curious and not borderline obsessed. Or I could go full neighborhood detective. I chose the latter. So I made a plan. And I was going in. I didn't waste any more time. I couldn't. The next evening I grabbed my backpack, stuffed it with some basic tools, and drove over to Gary's place. I had a small crowbar, just in case the side door was locked, and a flashlight. Nothing too obvious, but enough to get me through whatever I needed. I could see the faint light through the curtains in Gary's kitchen. It was dim, like he was keeping things low-key, but the house wasn't completely dark. My heart raced in my chest, a mixture of anticipation and that awful bone-deep feeling of something being very, very wrong. I turned off the engine and sat for a few minutes listening. It was too quiet. Normally, in small towns like this, you hear all sorts of sounds at night: crickets, dogs barking, the hum of distant traffic. But not tonight, not here, it was just still. I moved fast, staying low and trying not to make any noise. I circled the back of the house where that metal hatch was. It felt even stranger up close, the heavy smell of earth lingering in the air. I ran my fingers over the cement where it met the foundation. It was warm, like it had been freshly poured just a few hours ago. My skin prickled. The hatch was still sealed tight, but the keypad was glowing faintly, like it was waiting for someone to press it. I backed away and peered through the kitchen window. I could see the faint silhouette of someone moving inside. Slow, deliberate. I didn't see Gary's face, but whoever it was, they were walking oddly, like they were carrying something. The way their arms swung didn't feel normal, almost robotic. My breath caught in my throat, but I pushed myself to stay calm. This was it. I wasn't leaving without answers. I checked my phone for the time. 11:58 p.m. The trail cam I'd set up earlier had shown some action just before 2 a.m. If I was going to get in, I needed to move quickly. I circled back around to the front, just in time to see a car pull into Gary's driveway. It was an unmarked black SUV, no one I recognized. They parked and didn't get out. The engine idled and I could see a shadow inside, a tall figure sitting motionless. For a moment I considered going back, getting out of here before I got too deep, but something about that car, something about the silence, told me I needed to stay. I waited for what felt like forever, but the figure didn't move. Eventually the car turned off and the shadow inside disappeared. I didn't hear a door open. I didn't hear footsteps. That's it, I thought. I'm going in. I made my way to the side of the house, staying low. I could hear the faint sound of the floor creaking from inside. The hum of the ventilation pipe was louder now, almost buzzing. Something big was moving down there. I knew I only had a small window. The last thing I wanted was to get caught. So I carefully reached for the crowbar in my bag and pried open the small wooden shed by the back gate. I didn't know what I was looking for, just anything that could give me an edge. Inside the shed, I found what I needed. A crowbar would have been a bit too noisy, but I found a loose piece of plywood that I could use to cover the small hatch. With my heart in my throat, I shoved it aside, grabbed the keycard from the old computer parts I'd found, and approached the side hatch. It was just a simple press on the button, a slight buzzing sound. The hatch door opened, revealing a dark, narrow tunnel leading downward. Air inside was stifling, damp. The tunnel seemed to stretch farther than I expected, too far for the small hatch to have been practical. I slid down into the narrow space, keeping my back low, trying not to let the walls scrape my arms. The metal walls around me felt strange, like they hadn't been there long. There was a new smell, like something had been painted just a few hours ago. I got to the bottom of the ladder, and it felt like the ground just dropped out from under me. It wasn't just a storage area. It was a bunker bigger than I'd imagined, but not exactly what I'd expected either. The walls were lined with shelves full of crates, cables running along the floors. Some of the shelves were empty, some had items wrapped in plastic, things I couldn't quite identify. I kept moving forward toward a small room at the far end. That's when I saw it. The door. It wasn't like anything I had seen before. A reinforced steel door with an old, rusty lock. The metal was tarnished. It had clearly been there for years. But the thing that made my blood run cold. It was marked like a warning sign, except it was written in a language I didn't understand. Some symbols that were too distorted to read, almost as if they were carved into the door with something sharp. I stood there frozen. My instincts screamed at me to leave, to forget about this whole mess, but my feet wouldn't move. They were glued to the spot. Behind that door was something important, something worth hiding, something far worse than I could have imagined. I was deep enough now to know there was no turning back. The door wouldn't budge. I pulled and yanked at the rusty handle, but it felt like the metal had fused together over the years. I could see the faintest outline of a keypad beside it, worn down from years of use or years of avoidance. Whatever it wasn't just a door, it was a barrier. A barrier to something important. I stared at it for a while, half my mind screaming at me to turn around to get the hell out of this godforsaken place. But I couldn't, not now, not after everything I'd already seen. I ran my hands over the keypad. It looked like an old, outdated model, nothing high-tech. I could have cracked it with the right tools, but there was something more to this, something that felt wrong. I could almost hear a voice in my head, a whisper that told me this wasn't just about Gary anymore. This was bigger. I was getting too deep, but I had to know. I stepped back, trying to think. There had to be something I missed, something that would give me a clue about what the hell Gary had gotten himself into. And then I saw it. A small piece of paper, tucked into the corner of a shelf, barely noticeable. It was folded in half, but the corner was peeking out. My breath hitched when I saw what was written on it. It was a date, a year, 2023. A place, a name. And the phrase that made my stomach drop: final evacuation, protocol activated. I felt dizzy. For a moment, everything around me seemed to spin. This wasn't just some crazy conspiracy, this was real. Something was happening, something Gary knew about, and he wasn't the only one. The message made it clear that this wasn't his personal project. There were others involved. I stuffed the paper into my pocket, feeling the weight of it like a ticking time bomb. But as I did, a low, grinding sound echoed through the narrow passageway behind me. The ventilation pipe. It had started humming again, but this time it was different. It wasn't the faint buzzing I'd heard before. It was louder, more intense, almost as if something was forcing its way through it. I turned, heart pounding in my chest, and watched as the air duct shifted, the metal groaning under pressure. My first instinct was to bolt, but I couldn't tear myself away from the strange sight in front of me. Something was moving through it. Suddenly there was a noise from above the hatch. Someone had opened it. Shit. I had to get out, fast. I ran back to the ladder, but halfway up my foot slipped. I barely caught myself on the rungs. My heart was in my throat, and I had the overwhelming feeling of being watched. As I pulled myself up, my hand brushed against the edge of the hatch, and I heard it, a whisper, faint but clear. Get out. The voice was harsh, strained, like someone who'd been hiding in the shadows for too long. My breath hitched. I knew who it was without even seeing him. It was Gary. I didn't stop to look back. I bolted through the yard, through the dark, and didn't stop running until I was safely in my truck, engine roaring to life. I didn't know if Gary had followed me or if he was still down there, but I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't go back. At least not yet. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that door, the strange symbols, the paper with the date, the evacuation protocol. It wasn't just about Gary anymore. Whatever was going on, it involved far more people than I'd imagined. And it was coming. I called Eli the next morning. You gotta help me, I said, voice shaking. There's a plan, a real plan, and I think they're preparing for something that's going to happen soon. He was quiet for a long moment, then finally said, You're in deeper than I thought. You need to get out of there. Don't go back to Gary's house. I'll see what I can dig up, but you need to lay low. This could be bigger than just a bunker. I'll call you in a few hours. I hung up, my mind reeling. But I didn't feel safe anymore. Not in my own home, not in my town. Because Gary wasn't the only one building a bunker. He was just the tip of the iceberg. And now, I was in the middle of something I didn't understand, something I wasn't sure I wanted to. But one thing was clear, whatever was coming, it was already too late to stop it. The next few days were a blur. I couldn't focus on anything. Every noise, every movement felt like it was a sign, a warning. I stayed at home, packing, rereading the paper with the evacuation date, running through the details over and over in my head. The more I thought about it, the more questions piled up. Eli had told me to lay low, to stay quiet. He said he'd get back to me with information as soon as possible, but it didn't feel like enough. I needed to know who was behind this, what was really going on. But then that afternoon, Eli called me. His voice was low, almost strained. Get to the old mill west of town. I've got something for you. My pulse spiked. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my keys and drove as fast as I could, barely aware of the turns I took. The mill was abandoned, the kind of place people rarely went to anymore, covered in rust and weeds. I remembered passing by it when I first moved here, but I never gave it much thought. Now it felt like the only place that mattered. I pulled up to the overgrown lot and parked behind the crumbling stone building. Eli was waiting, his eyes scanning the surroundings like he was expecting someone. You didn't tell me what this is about, I said, stepping out of the truck. I didn't want you to know too much yet, but I've been digging, Eli said, his voice tinged with urgency. He handed me a manila envelope. I ripped it open and inside were documents, official ones. Government documents, I muttered. What the hell? Eli nodded. I told you this was bigger. The people involved, well, they're not just a bunch of paranoid conspiracy theorists. They're part of a network that's been planning this for years. What's happening with Gary is part of a much larger plan, and it's been happening under our noses. I scanned through the papers, but the details were overwhelming. One name kept popping up, though. Mason Corp. I'd heard whispers about them over the years, nothing solid, just rumors. But this was different. The company wasn't just a shadowy organization. They were part of a global initiative preparing for some kind of widespread collapse. They'd been setting up bunkers, building networks, buying up land for decades. And Gary wasn't just a neighbor. He had been recruited. He was part of the Mason project. His whole life had been leading up to this moment. Why Gary? I asked, barely able to process the information. Why was he involved? Eli took a breath. Gary was just one of the many. He was chosen because of his skills. People like him, isolated, introverted, they're perfect for a life underground. They know how to survive when society falls apart. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. I couldn't understand how it could have gotten this far without anyone noticing. How could something this big stay hidden? The bunker, I whispered, it's not just for survival, it's a test. Exactly, Eli said, his voice quiet. They need people like Gary to prove they can make it out there in isolation. They'll be sending people like him to these underground cities when things finally go south, but it's all a big secret. You're not supposed to know about it. You were never supposed to stumble on this. I stared at the papers again. The implications of everything, the date on the paper, the protocols, hit me hard. We have to stop this. We have to let people know what's coming, I said, my voice shaking with anger and fear. Eli hesitated. It's not that simple. Mason Corp has connections everywhere. This goes all the way to the top. People who have the power to cover this up. Then what the hell do we do? I asked, desperate. Eli looked at me, his eyes full of regret. We make sure you're not next. If you stay here, they'll come after you. You've seen too much. It's too dangerous. I'm not running, I said, clenching my fists. I'm not just going to leave everything behind. Eli sighed. I didn't want you to know this much, but now that you do, there's no going back. Mason is preparing, and they've already started moving. I froze. What do you mean, moving? Eli handed me another set of papers, this time with specific coordinates and a timeline. The map was terrifyingly precise. They're already relocating people, the bunkers are full, and now they're preparing for the second phase. I think they're starting to activate other sites. Yours is one of them. I felt my world collapse in on itself. The town, the people I'd known my whole life, were caught up in something far worse than I'd ever imagined. The evacuation was real, but it wasn't just for Gary. It was for anyone who knew too much, anyone who had seen what was coming. I looked at Eli, shaking my head. What do we do now? You keep your head down. Don't trust anyone who isn't already in on it, Eli warned. And if you want to survive, you'll have to disappear. Fast. I didn't know what came next. I didn't know how much time we had, or how far Mason's reach truly extended. But one thing was clear. It wasn't over. And whatever happened next, I knew I couldn't trust anyone but myself. The rest of the night felt like a blur. I left the mill, the weight of everything pressing down on me. I didn't know if I could ever make things right, or if I was just another piece in someone else's game, but I knew this. I couldn't stay in this town any longer. It wasn't safe. And whatever was coming, whatever Gary had been preparing for, I wasn't going to let it catch me off guard.